Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Man at the Window. The first time Sophie Reid saw the man outside her house, she barely thought about him. It was a little after 11 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after she had moved into number 14 Calder Street. She was standing at the kitchen sink with her sleeves pushed to her elbows, rinsing a wine glass beneath the tap, when she happened to glance through the window above it. A man was standing on the opposite pavement. He was perhaps 50, although the orange streetlight made it difficult to be certain. He wore a dark, waterproof jacket and ordinary trousers, and there was nothing particularly memorable about his face. He wasn't staring directly at Sophie's house. If anything, he seemed to be looking further along the street. She watched him for a few seconds. Then he took a phone from his pocket and looked at the screen. Someone waiting for a lift, Sophie decided. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. By morning, she had forgotten about him. That was one of the things Sophie liked about Calder Street. Nothing happened there. It was a short residential street of old terraced houses where recycling bins remained outside for days after collection, and neighbors apologized when their hedges grew across one another's fences. A narrow pedestrian lane at the far end led toward the railway station, so there were usually a few strangers passing through, particularly in the evenings. After 9 years living in flats, first with friends and then with her husband, the little house still felt slightly extravagant, despite the damp patch behind the washing machine and the bedroom window that refused to close properly unless Sophie pushed her shoulder against the frame. The separation had been remarkably undramatic. No affairs, no screaming arguments, no plates thrown against walls. She and Matthew had simply reached the unpleasant realization that they were much better at remembering who had bought milk than remembering why they had wanted to live together in the first place. He had kept the flat. Sophie had taken almost everything else she actually cared about. Her books, her mother's old coffee table, and a ridiculous ceramic duck Matthew had always hated. Calder Street was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, perhaps a year, long enough to work out what came next. The man appeared again on Friday. Sophie was sitting in the living room watching television when she noticed movement through a narrow gap in the curtains. Across the road, beneath the same streetlight, stood the same man. This time he wasn't looking at a phone. He simply stood with both hands in the pockets of his jacket. Sophie leaned slightly toward the window without touching the curtain. It could easily have been somebody else. She had seen the first man for seconds. Same height, perhaps. Same jacket. That meant nothing. She watched for perhaps a minute. Then the man turned and walked away. Not quickly. Not as though he had realized she was watching. He simply left. By Sunday, Sophie had forgotten about him again. On Monday, he returned. This time he stood 2 houses further down. Sophie noticed him while closing the living room curtains. Her hand stopped halfway. The man was facing the houses. She couldn't tell which one. She closed the curtains. Then, irritated with herself, she opened them again. He was still there. People were allowed to stand on pavements, she reminded herself. There were 20 houses on the street. She had no idea whether he was looking at hers. She went upstairs, brushed her teeth, and deliberately avoided the bedroom window. 20 minutes later, curiosity won. Sophie turned off the bedroom light before moving the curtain aside. The street light was empty. She slept normally. The following evening, at 11:17, he was back. Sophie stared at him from the kitchen. The man's head lifted. For the first time, there was no uncertainty about where he was looking. He was looking directly at her window. Sophie stepped backwards. The movement was instinctive and immediate, and she hated herself for it almost as soon as she'd done it. She waited perhaps 30 seconds before approaching the window again. The pavement was empty. At work the next morning, she mentioned it to a colleague. "Probably fancies you," Karen said. Sophie gave her a look. "Standing outside my house at 11 at night? All right, probably doesn't fancy you." "I'm serious." "So am I. Have you actually seen him doing anything?" "No." "Has he approached you?" "No." "Maybe he lives nearby." That was precisely the problem. Every explanation sounded reasonable when Sophie said it aloud. The following night she didn't see him, nor the night after. By Friday she had started to feel foolish. Then shortly before midnight, she heard the metal gate at the front of the house move. Sophie muted the television. The sound didn't repeat. She waited. Eventually, she crossed the living room and looked through the curtains. The man stood directly outside her gate. There was no phone in his hand. He wasn't pretending to wait for anyone. He was staring at the house. Sophie remained perfectly still. The man raised his eyes. Their gaze met through the glass. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't react at all. He simply looked at her. Sophie grabbed her phone from the sofa and opened the camera. By the time she returned to the window, he was walking away. She managed one photograph. It was blurred, but his face was visible. The next morning, Sophie saw the woman from number 12 sweeping leaves from her front step. Her name was Margaret. They had spoken twice since Sophie moved in, mostly about bin collections. "Can I ask you something strange?" Margaret rested both hands on the broom. "Go on." Sophie showed her the photograph. Margaret's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "You know him?" "No." "But you've seen him." Margaret handed the phone back. "Where was he?" "Outside my gate." "When?" "Last night." Margaret looked toward number 14. Sophie waited. "What?" "I've seen him before." Something tightened in Sophie's stomach. "Recently." Margaret shook her head. "Before you moved in." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. "The woman who lived there before you," Margaret continued. "He used to stand across the road sometimes." Sophie looked at her house. "Did she know him?" "I don't know. She wasn't particularly sociable." "What was her name?" "Laura. Laura Bennett, I think." "Why did she leave?" Margaret hesitated. "She just went." "What does that mean?" "One week she was there. Next week she wasn't. A van came for her things afterwards." Sophie glanced again at the photograph. "Did she ever say anything about him?" "Not to me." Margaret looked uncomfortable now. "There was one night the police came." "When?" "A month or two before she left. I don't know what happened. I didn't ask." Sophie thanked her and went inside. For the first time since moving in, number 14 no longer felt entirely like her house. She walked through the rooms slowly. There were marks she'd never paid attention to before. 2 small filled holes beside the bedroom window. Scratches around the back door lock beneath a layer of white paint. A rectangular patch inside the hallway where the wall was a slightly different shade. All perfectly ordinary remnants of previous occupants. Yesterday, she wouldn't have noticed any of them. Now each seemed capable of having a history. Sophie emailed the letting agency. The reply came that afternoon. They couldn't disclose personal information about previous tenants, but they assured her that all locks had been changed before her tenancy began. It wasn't the answer she'd asked for. That evening, she kept the curtains closed. At 10:45, she checked the front door. At 10:50, she checked it again. By 11, she was annoyed with herself. This was exactly how fear worked, she thought. It took ordinary things and promoted them. A noise became a footstep. A stranger became a threat. Scratches in old paint became evidence. At 11:23, Sophie looked through the smallest possible gap in the curtains. Nobody was there. She felt relieved. Then she noticed the folded piece of paper on the floor beneath the letterbox. Sophie stared at it. She had been downstairs for almost an hour. She hadn't heard the letterbox open. She picked the paper up. 3 words had been written in block capitals. "Where is it?" Sophie read them twice. Then she opened the front door. The street was empty. She called the police. 2 officers arrived 40 minutes later. They were polite and took her seriously, which somehow made the situation feel worse. Sophie showed them the photograph and explained what Margaret had told her. One officer photographed the note. "Do you know what this refers to?" he asked. "No." "Nothing left in the property when you moved in?" "Some rubbish under the sink. That's about it." "Have you had contact with the previous tenant?" "I don't even know her." The officers searched the small garden and alleyway beside the terrace. Nothing had been disturbed. They advised Sophie to keep the doors and windows locked, document further sightings, and call immediately if the man returned or attempted to enter the property. It was sensible advice. It also meant that for now, there was very little anyone could do. Sophie slept with the hallway light on. The man didn't appear for 4 days. By the 5th, Sophie had installed a video doorbell and a small camera overlooking the back garden. Matthew had offered to stay over, but she refused. "You don't have to prove anything," he told her over the phone. "I'm not proving anything." "Then why won't you let me come?" "Because if I leave this house or have someone babysit me every time some idiot stands outside, then I'm never going to feel comfortable here again." There was a pause. "Call me if anything happens." "I will." Sophie appreciated that he didn't argue. The next sighting happened on Wednesday afternoon. That frightened her more than any of the others. She was coming home from work shortly after 5 when she saw him beside the pedestrian lane at the end of Calder Street. Daylight changed him. He looked older than Sophie had thought, mid-50s perhaps, thinning gray hair, clean-shaven, the sort of face she might have passed in a supermarket without remembering. He was holding a carrier bag. For one absurd moment, the ordinariness of it reassured her. Then he saw her. He stopped walking. Sophie stopped too. 20 meters separated them. Cars moved along the main road behind her. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. Sophie took out her phone. The man turned into the pedestrian lane. She didn't follow. That night, she checked the doorbell recordings. He had visited the house at 2:14 that afternoon. The footage showed him walking through the gate and approaching the front door. He didn't knock. He leaned toward the camera, examining it. Then he looked through the living room window. For almost 20 seconds, he stood completely still. Finally, he walked away. Sophie sent the recording to the police. The following morning, she received another note. It had been pushed beneath the garden gate rather than through the letterbox, presumably to avoid the camera. She left it there. Sophie stood in the hallway reading the sentence. This time she understood one thing. The notes weren't about her. They were about Laura Bennett. Sophie spent that evening searching the house. She began carefully, opening cupboards and checking drawers. Within an hour, she was moving furniture. There was nothing beneath the bed, nothing behind the wardrobe, nothing taped underneath drawers or concealed behind bookshelves. She searched the kitchen last. The units were old and cheaply fitted, with narrow kickboards running along the floor beneath them. Sophie noticed one section wasn't quite flush with the others. She crouched and pulled. The panel came loose. Behind it was dust, a dried pea, 2 bottle caps, and an empty space extending beneath the cupboards. Sophie shone her phone torch inside. Something reflected the light. Her heartbeat changed. She reached into the darkness. Her fingers touched plastic. Sophie pulled out a small transparent freezer bag. Inside was a USB drive. For several seconds, she remained crouched on the kitchen floor. Then she heard footsteps outside. Sophie switched off the phone torch. The footsteps stopped. She slowly stood. Through the darkened kitchen window, she could see the street beyond the back garden, but not the front pavement. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. Sophie opened the live feed. The man stood outside the gate. He was looking directly into the camera. Sophie backed away from the window. The man remained there for almost a minute. Then he left. She didn't plug the USB drive into her laptop. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen table and called the police. While she waited, she phoned Matthew. "I found something." "What?" "I don't know yet. A USB drive. It was hidden under the kitchen units." "Don't touch anything else." "I've already touched it." "You know what I mean." Sophie walked into the living room. "What if this is what he wants?" "Then give it to the police." "I am." "Good." Sophie approached the curtain. "And stop looking out the bloody window." Despite herself, she smiled. "I wasn't." "You absolutely were." The police collected the drive that night. For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt that something concrete had happened. There was an object, evidence, something that might explain why a stranger had been watching her home. 2 days later, an officer called. The drive contained photographs, scanned documents, and audio recordings. They couldn't tell Sophie everything while inquiries were ongoing, but they confirmed that some of the material appeared to relate to a man named Peter Vance. Sophie recognized the name from nowhere. "Is that him?" "We believe so." "What did Laura have on him?" The officer paused. Some of the material appears to concern another woman. What does that mean? A former colleague of Mr. Vance. She disappeared 3 years ago. Sophie sat down. Disappeared? Her whereabouts are still unknown. And Laura? We're trying to locate her. You don't know where she is? We've made contact with someone we believe is a relative. That's all I can tell you at the moment. After the call, Sophie remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was silent around her. She imagined Laura sitting in the same chair, Laura removing the kickboard, Laura pushing the little plastic bag into the darkness. Why hide it rather than take it with her? Perhaps she'd intended to return. Perhaps she had been frightened somebody would search her belongings. Perhaps she'd simply run out of time. That evening, Sophie noticed something strange. The man wasn't outside. She checked at 11. Then midnight. Nothing. The following night was the same. By Saturday, his absence had begun to feel like an answer. The police had the drive. Whatever Peter Vance had wanted was no longer inside number 14. It was over. On Sunday morning, Sophie opened every curtain in the house. She cleaned the kitchen, put music on, and spent 20 minutes trying to force the loose kickboard properly back into place. At lunchtime, Margaret knocked on the door with a parcel that had been delivered to her house by mistake. You look better, Margaret said. I feel better. Has he gone? Seems like it. Sophie considered telling her about the USB drive, but decided against it. That evening, she spoke to Matthew, cooked dinner, and watched half a film before falling asleep on the sofa. She woke at 1:07 a.m. The television had returned to its menu screen. For a few seconds, Sophie didn't know what had woken her. Then she heard the sound, a faint metallic scrape. From the kitchen. Sophie sat upright. Nothing followed. She reached for her phone. The back door camera showed the garden empty. The doorbell camera showed the front step. Empty. Sophie listened. Another scrape. Closer. She stood. The kitchen light was off, but the glow from the television reached the doorway. Sophie took 2 steps toward it. A thin line of cold air touched her face. The back door was open. Only a few centimeters, but open. Sophie stopped breathing. She knew she'd locked it. She had checked it before going to sleep. Her phone was already in her hand. She backed toward the stairs and dialed 999. The operator answered. Sophie kept her voice low. Someone's in my house. As she spoke, she looked toward the living room window. For weeks, that window had been the place she looked whenever she was afraid. The place where he stood. The pavement beyond it was empty. And Sophie finally understood why that frightened her more than seeing him there ever had. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Sophie ran. She didn't think about shoes or keys. She pulled the front door open and sprinted into the street, still speaking to the emergency operator. Behind her, something moved inside the house. Sophie ran to number 12 and hammered on Margaret's door. Lights came on upstairs. Then Sophie heard her own front door open. She turned. Peter Vance stepped onto the pavement. He didn't run toward her. He simply stood in the doorway. For the first time, there was no glass between them, no road, no uncertainty about who he was looking at. He looked at Sophie, then at the phone against her ear, and walked away. He's leaving, Sophie told the operator. He's walking toward the lane. Do not follow him. I won't. Peter reached the end of the street. A police car turned into Calder Street. He ran. That was the first time Sophie had ever seen him hurry. He made it halfway through the pedestrian lane before officers caught him. The search of number 14 found a screwdriver beside the back door and a pair of gloves in the upstairs hallway. More importantly, officers found scratches around the kitchen kickboard. Peter had been searching for the drive. He had apparently watched Sophie remove it several nights earlier. The police later established that he had been entering the back garden through neighboring properties, keeping himself outside the range of Sophie's camera before approaching along the narrow strip directly beneath the kitchen window. He had watched her search. He had seen her find something, and he had known. The message Sophie found the following morning had not been there when the police first searched the property after his arrest. It was discovered beneath a flower pot near the back gate, protected from the rain inside a clear plastic sleeve. 2 words. You found it. Peter Vance was charged with offenses relating to Sophie and with the earlier stalking of Laura Bennett. The contents of the USB drive reopened the investigation into the disappearance of his former colleague, a woman named Claire Morrison. Months later, Sophie learned what Laura had done. Laura and Claire had worked together. After Claire disappeared, Laura had become convinced that Peter knew more than he admitted. She began collecting anything she could find: copies of messages Claire had sent her, photographs of Peter waiting outside their workplace, audio recordings of conversations and notes documenting the occasions when he followed her home. Then Peter realized what Laura was doing. He began appearing outside number 14, exactly as he later would for Sophie. Laura went to the police, but much of what she had gathered was circumstantial. She became increasingly frightened and eventually left Calder Street with almost no warning. She hid the drive because she believed Peter had searched her car once already. She intended to retrieve it after moving. She never did. Not because Peter killed her, not because she vanished. The truth was much more ordinary. Laura had been so frightened that once she reached her sister's house 200 miles away, she couldn't make herself go back. She changed her number, found another job, and tried to forget about number 14. The drive remained beneath the kitchen cupboard, and Peter kept returning, waiting for Laura, waiting for somebody who knew where she'd gone. Then Sophie moved in. At first, Peter hadn't known whether Sophie was connected to Laura. So he watched. He watched long enough to learn when Sophie came home, which lights she switched on, when she went upstairs, whether anyone stayed overnight. And eventually he convinced himself that Laura must have told her something. The police found notebooks in Peter's home, pages of dates and times, descriptions of Sophie leaving for work, returning with shopping, speaking to Margaret, taking rubbish outside. One entry was only 4 words long: "She doesn't know yet." Another, written 2 weeks later, read, "She is looking now." Peter had mistaken Sophie's growing fear for knowledge. His own behavior had caused her to search the house, and by trying to recover the evidence Laura had hidden, he had led Sophie directly to it. 6 months after Peter's arrest, Sophie moved out of Calder Street. She told people it was because the tenancy was ending. That was partly true. The real reason was that she never completely recovered the feeling she'd had that final night when she looked through the window and saw an empty pavement. She moved into a second-floor flat on the other side of town. There was a secure entrance downstairs, cameras in the communal hallway, and no garden gate for anyone to stand beside. For the first few weeks, Sophie kept the curtains closed after dark. Eventually, she stopped. Peter Vance was in custody, awaiting trial. Laura Bennett had given a formal statement. The investigation into Claire Morrison's disappearance was continuing. There was no reason to keep looking outside. One rainy evening in November, Sophie arrived home shortly after 9. She made dinner, spoke briefly to Matthew, and sat beside the window with a book. Half an hour later, she realized she'd read the same page 3 times. Someone was standing across the road. Sophie looked up. A man waited beneath the awning of a closed shop. Dark jacket, hands in his pockets. Her body reacted before her mind did. Then a bus pulled in. The man checked his phone, stepped from beneath the awning, and climbed aboard. The bus drove away. Sophie remained beside the window. After a while, she laughed quietly at herself. She closed the book and went to make tea. Before leaving the room, she looked outside once more. The pavement was empty. This time she let it be empty. But for the rest of her life, whenever Sophie passed a lit window after dark, she found herself wondering how much could be learned about the person on the other side simply by standing still and watching. What time they came home, which room they slept in, whether they lived alone, how often they checked the lock, and how long it would take them to notice that the same man had been standing across the road every night.